What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some first impressions for The Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall, a game that I have actually technically played a couple times previously, but have never fully played through in the entire main story for a variety of reasons, but recently that's been made much easier to do via Daggerfall Unity, which is a recreation of the entire game via the Unity game engine, which means it's infinitely easier to play on modern hardware these days as compared to the old DOS version. But first, let's address the elephant in the room. I'm calling this a first impressions video, but I've already played the game, and I realize an act like that might just call my integrity into question, but those are the kinds of daredevil antics you're going to have to get used to if you plan on hanging around this channel very long. Moving on with the rest of the video though, if I were to broadly sum up what I know of Daggerfall and the experience I do have with it prior to actually going through the entirety of the main story and the content that is not purely radiant and procedurally generated, I would say that Daggerfall is a surprisingly systems-dense game, especially for a game that came out when it did, all the way back in 1996. But the sort of trade-off there is that content-wise, there's really not that much to it. In fact, the vast majority of the game is procedurally generated systems and dungeons and the like. This makes the entire game, really, more of a sort of fantasy life simulator, rather than something you might be accustomed to today. Because in terms of like handcrafted content, you're literally just looking at the main story and a couple of optional quests related to the main story. With even stuff like the Daedric quests ultimately being things like, go here, kill this specific monster type, come back within a certain time frame, get reward. So discounting the main story, if what you enjoy about video games is in fact that handcrafted content, and let's be honest, gameplay that's a little newer than this, Daggerfall is extremely dated. But if you enjoy those sort of fantasy life simulator aspects and building an incredibly specific character, which we'll get into momentarily, there's really not a lot of games that do that better than Daggerfall, even by today's standards, which is why people are waiting on that release, The Wayward Realms, which is aiming to be a more modern take of something like Daggerfall. But from there, let's back it up a little bit and talk about a few specific things. So I mentioned Daggerfall Unity. If you're playing Daggerfall these days, especially if you're just now trying to get into it, you're definitely using Daggerfall Unity. And you're going to do that by basically just picking up Daggerfall, which is just free now, by the way. If you didn't know, you can just get that on, say, Steam or wherever else for, again, free. Install that to your computer, then go download Daggerfall Unity, which is the engine replacement. Start that, point it towards your install of Daggerfall, and you're good to go. That's really all you've got to do. And then you'll have access to all of the mods and stuff that are made available through Unity to customize it even further in typical sort of Bethesda fashion, really. But also, the engine replacement comes with a whole host of quality of life stuff, namely getting rid of all the things that make playing Daggerfall incredibly difficult, even beyond just the fact of the game itself. Meaning things like the game's notoriously labyrinthian dungeons that are procedurally generated and with that procedural generation can sometimes be incompletable or put things that you need behind things that are impossible to traverse, can all be done away with simply by simplifying all the dungeons and making them dramatically smaller and thus easier to navigate. It also simplifies things like, just using your weapons or, actually making the save system reliable and not constantly causing you all sorts of issues. Now, Daggerfall Unity released into its 1.0 version a couple years back, and that is the part I have not actually played at all, not to mention the rest of the main story. But from there, let's talk about a few other things. So one of my absolute favorite things about Daggerfall is just how incredibly specific the character creation lets you be. Because while if you've ever played something like Morrowind, you'd probably be familiar with the basics of it, but here it's obviously in a slightly rougher state. But what I really enjoy that they have ultimately cut is all of the little things, like for instance, giving your character special advantages and disadvantages, which then affects the amount of experience you need in order to level up, or skill advancements, I should say, that you need to level up. And this can be stuff like giving yourself crippling weaknesses to certain types of magic, forbidding your character from equipping certain types of things like, say, leather armor, chain armor, that kind of stuff. Or on the opposite end of that, giving your character huge advantages that can make your life easier, on top of everything else. Now, the catch to this is that some of this is clunky. In fact, Unity went out of their way to fix some of it. A common exploit was actually to play as a high elf, which is immune to paralysis, but then give yourself a crippling weakness to paralysis, which would give you a huge leg up on everything else in terms of advantages. Unity doesn't let you do that. It caps at like 50% resistance now instead. Unity also made changes to the personality stat. That is to say, it's actually useful now. In the original version of the game, you could drop personality down to like 10 in order to raise up other stats instead, and this would have essentially no effect on the rest of the game because nothing really used personality in terms of things you are required to do, like say talking to people. But even just things like skills for the classes, which uses again Morrowind's and Oblivion's system if you are unfamiliar, we pick a bunch of primary and minor and major skills that will then help us level up by simply raising these in a sort of level by doing system. But the catch is that there are 35 skills in Daggerfall, with a significant number of them being things like languages. Languages effectively give you a % chance to pacify that enemy type when you come into contact with them, rather than say actually giving you the ability to genuinely speak with them. But then there's all sorts of other skills, like climbing and medical, etc. And while obviously some of this is more useful than others, collectively, I think Daggerfall does such a fantastic job, even by today's standards, of just letting you play the character you want to play, which is going to be especially important, I think, because if you dig a little bit deeper than that, Daggerfall, like most of Bethesda's games really, it is incredibly easy to become overpowered once you know what you're doing. If you do know what you're doing, you can become overpowered almost immediately, gain a couple levels, and then be an unstoppable killing machine right out of the gate. Whereas if you don't know what you're doing, you might make a character that is almost certainly going to struggle, to say the very least, with the opening acts of the game. But even that character, if you stuck with it, could probably become overpowered if you wanted to deal with that headache. But obviously in today's day and age, we certainly don't want that. And this is something I'll probably wind up going more in depth on when I actually do the review of this game, which will be the follow-up to this. But the reason a lot of people struggle with this game, outside of just its dated systems, is the fact that this is the kind of game that came with a manual that was meant to explain all of this stuff to you, which is obviously not something we see when you just pick it up for free now, which is something Daggerfall Unity tries to address by adding a sort of proper tutorial to the game, which is going to give you a little bit of direction while you figure out the controls and everything, which I think was a nice touch. But realistically, the first big challenge of Daggerfall comes pretty much immediately by putting you into Privateer's Hold, the first dungeon and main quest, which is effectively just to get out of this dungeon after you get shipwrecked, coming to Daggerfall on the Emperor's orders to investigate some political drama here and there. Now, this is, again, something I'll go into in the actual review. I'm not going to bother with it here. But your first main quest is to literally just get out of this dungeon you find yourself in. And that's going to prove a little bit difficult, kind of no matter what you do, but almost certainly is going to be easier or harder depending upon the character that you actually made. And this is because one of the first things you'll understand about Daggerfall is that the early game has a huge knowledge gap associated with it. For instance, in this first dungeon, there are multiple enemies you won't be able to hit unless you have at least a steel or better weapon, and you're actually probably going to start with iron unless you picked some specific background choices that give you an ebony dagger. It's also where you're going to have to get to grips with the game's controls and everything, which means you're probably going to die in this dungeon a lot. But once you do eventually make it out of that dungeon and you're greeted with the wide open world, the immediate thing you have to concern yourself with is the fact that Daggerfall is impossibly large. Trying to navigate it on foot is just an impossibility, frankly, which means everything you do comes down to fast travel, and you're almost certainly going to first and foremost make your way to the city of Daggerfall itself, which is where you can start interacting with the game world and getting some levels under your belt, which is going to be necessary to actually advance the main quest, which won't even start until you hit level 3. But once you get to that big city is where the rest of the game's systems quickly become apparent. So the early game and kind of the questing in general is basically going to see you more than likely joining up with a guild to get some access to some quick and easy features like the Spellmaker from the Mages Guild, or simply a free place to rest in the Fighters Guild, as you work up some gold to buy some convenience things like, say, a wagon or a horse to take with you on dungeons to haul back all that loot you're going to need to sell to get the money to fund all of this. Or alternatively, you could take out a loan and try to go about it that way, or perhaps even find the Thieves Guild, or if you happen to be of a murderous persuasion, perhaps even meet up with the Dark Brotherhood, all of which is here and available, but mostly just gives you Radiant quests in order to, again, help you kind of get your feet wet before jumping on the actual story. Which is why, from basically that point onward, Daggerfall is really more about the story you make from your character interacting with all these systems and what that kind of leads to and the experiences you wind up having, because it's entirely possible to just completely botch the main quest, or, ignore it entirely, which would do the same thing, and instead just carry on a life of adventuring, joining up with one of the game's many nightly orders, and carving out your own story against this fantasy backdrop. And that's really the marvel of Daggerfall. And ultimately, what I want the review of this game that I'm going to do to really hit on is all of the sort of secret stuff you can find. Like, for instance, I've been mentioning that there's not a ton of sort of handcrafted content throughout this video, but I'm sure somebody will be screaming in the comments about things like the vampire quest lines or the covens, which are all technically still Radiant quests, by the way, but do technically offer some secrets and things to discover just through gameplay. And that's the kind of thing I want to highlight alongside the actual main story. And while I'm sure there are people who have done that previously, it's something I've wanted to experience for myself for a long time, while hopefully making it a bit more accessible for anybody who happens to watch. But as for right now, impressions-wise, I guess I really just wanted to say that it is kind of wild that all these years later, there really is nothing else quite like Daggerfall, which I would imagine is exactly what fueled all the passion that went into something like Daggerfall Unity anyway. Now, in terms of the forthcoming review, it is going to take me a little while, not so much to get through the content I'll need to get through. Again, when you look at it from that scope, Daggerfall is not a terribly long game. And to be clear, this will be a retrospective. 100% would not make any sense here. But what I will have to do is clear up a few other things. For instance, Baldur's Gate 3 Patch 8 is coming out on the 15th. The Kingdom Come Deliverance 2's Hardcore mode is also coming out on the 15th. I've got a review for Clair Obscur I'll have to do towards the end of the month. Days Gone, of all things, is getting a DLC at the end of the month. So I've got a few things I'll have to do, but I'm kind of going to play this in the background of those things, so I have no idea exactly when I'll get this done, but it is something I've wanted to do for a long time, so I am very much so looking forward to playing through it. With that in mind, I certainly hope that you're looking forward to watching it. If you are, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below. But regardless of all of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.